Wednesday, May 27th. And I'm realizing as I say that, that's pretty much my job, is just to say the date and say, hi, Chris. And I think I do a pretty good job. I just, I'm not to pat myself on the back, but I haven't messed up the date yet. And the highs have all been natural. And, I think people feel the authenticity. So,
we were hoping, Joe, that everybody would find what they're really good at, through this whole thing. Like we told about reimagining what you're good at. And a calendar, buddy. You can do it, your days, dates, everything. So
I say, they call that a special purpose? Is that a special purpose?
It is. It's the purpose. Yeah, that's what we've all been wanting to find out. So welcome. We're glad you're here now. All right.
Yeah. That's a light bulb. Thank you.
My purpose is just to keep our chamber members and this business community informed about how things are going in our community and where things are going in the community. We've gone through a lot of the relief efforts and a lot of the reopen efforts, but I'd rather start again with just how are the numbers looking, because I do not want to get called back in and have to close things down. So the numbers are the number one thing we're cared about. So I'm going to grab your screen real quick, if you don't mind. Joe, we got two greens for the first time in a while now. So what we're seeing now is our weekly percentage. And remember, when you and I first started showing this was over 4%. We were trying to keep it under 6%. Now our weekly percentage after this amount of weeks is now down to 1.26. And our daily case average is starting to slowly go down again. This was the number you and I were concerned about. And let me just show you a little bit more about it. But the good news is the numbers are going down. Before I leave our scorecard, Joe, I do want to note another change. We have updated it. We now have the unemployment numbers from the last month. So this includes April's numbers, does not include May's numbers yet. And what I'd love to do is show you right here on the bottom. You see this negative 76,000 jobs over last year. So that means last year at this time, there were 76,000 more people working. And so this is the effects of COVID on us. The state alone lost 1 million jobs during this pandemic. Our community actually did better than the state did as far as percentage of it. So we lost about 16% of our workforce, lost their job during this. The state as a whole lost about 17.9, but 18%. So it's a lot of folks, and you can see how it affects these numbers. And now we've got our new unemployment number for Pinellas County at 13.9. Obviously, before this started, this was at 3.1%. So we've really increased that. And hopefully now you're going to start seeing that go down as people come back to work and as we reopen. This is the trend on that 14-day average we talked about, where you can see now 2 days in a row now, maybe we're starting off the next cycle. We talked about being as high as 24 during April 11th, and now we're hopefully coming back down off the 20 mark, which is what we were hopeful of. So that means that's the amount of people in our hospitals that we're dealing with, and that's what we really are nervous about. The other good news, I just want to show you the other gates that we talk about, is just that percent positive for the day. You're starting to see a trend now, Joe, where every day, even though we're testing quite a few people, you're seeing these 0.2 numbers. So not even 1% of our people. Like yesterday, 252 people were tested and one was positive. So we are seeing a drop off of this daily percent number, which is really important. We have seen a little increase in those conditions that can bring on the notion of COVID. So we always want to be on the lookout for it. But right now we're seeing all the trend numbers exactly where we need them to be. And finally, if you do get sick or if you're worried about going to the hospital, this number should help you, because again, we've got over 25% of our beds available for this crisis, and they're available right now. And you see 85% of our ventilators as well. So to me, we are in a safe environment. We're still in an environment that has COVID, and everybody, if you are vulnerable, you should not be out in our system right now. But those of you who are trying to get your jobs going and your business is back online, I would say you're ready to do it, as long as you wear that flocking mask, as we say. So that's my report on that, Joe. So, this is what we were hopeful of. Literally 2.5 weeks ago, you and I were like, geez, they're going to open this and what's going to happen? And we were all literally praying that we were going to get good numbers, and it just keeps coming that way. So I'm not trying to be a media hype on this, Joe, but I'm just trying to say things are working well, and let's keep moving in that direction.
I agree. Everybody's doing a fantastic job. Keep it up.
Yep. And so what I really want to talk about now is, well, I want to get back into the R's, and let's bring in Eric Smith from Inclusivity. And I want to set this up for him too, because we've talked about the R's. Let's bring him in, and I want to get his input into this. And there he is, as Eric Smith.
All right, Eric.
Yeah. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, how are you?
It's good to see you. Hey, listen, I'm going to set you up here. I just showed the numbers, and our numbers look good. We're starting to really get a handle on making sure our hospitals have the capacity to deal with the folks that they are getting positive cases from, but everything's looking good for our community. And we talked about the 4 R's a little bit. We launched the 4 R's a couple of weeks ago about the relief efforts, the reopen efforts, the recover efforts, and the reimagine efforts. So we've been talking about the 4 R's, but when you and I get together, we add a 5th R to that. Right. And it's a good conversation. The R is race. So I want to talk a little bit about equity in our movements here, in our reopening efforts, in our relief efforts, and in St. Pete efforts as well. And I couldn't think of anybody better than you to help us have a conversation on it. So before I get started on diving into this conversation, just introduce yourself to the Catalyst and Chamber audience, if you can.
So, hi, my name is Eric Smith. I'm the managing member for Inclusivity LLC. We are an organizational development firm with a cultural competence lens. We look at things from that cultural competence or equity perspective. We also really focus on the business case and why this is important. And we've been involved with the St. Pete community for a long time. I've been here for almost 10 years. My wife is born and raised here, and we just love what we do. Love hanging out with Chris Steinach and all the great work with the Chamber and Joe Hamilton. So, yeah, we're here and we're ready to dive in and help out our community.
Well, before we dive into it, let me just now you've also been very busy with babies. You got two young ones. Please give me an update on how your family is doing throughout this whole effort.
Being I consider myself a bit of an old head with young ones at 48 with a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. So I have to eat my Wheaties and spinach every day to keep my energy up for those little guys. But Eric and Carlton, those are my 2 young ones. They're great. They're loving being home with mommy and daddy. They're kind of not the wiser. I know they're kind of wondering, like, why are they both home all the time? And I'm like, well, mommy's at work. And they're like, no, she's not. She's in a room. So it's pretty interesting, but we have a lot of fun. We've been growing together. It's kind of it feels weird. I feel like they don't have the opportunity to see a lot of things that at their age out and about. But the time that we have in our neighborhood has been amazing. We live in an amazing area. Neighbors are really friendly. So they're also getting a different experience that I could not imagine of having the closeness of neighbors and family and community. So in one sense, it's different. But in another sense, it's amazing. I just heard my young one come flying past my office. So to have them this close is really amazing.
Yeah. So Joe Mark, Eric Down is another one of them. Eric, we're seeing it on every one of our broadcasts recently of just the executives who are like, you know what, this was not all bad. And
no, not at all.
And, it's so sad that it took death and destruction to make us really realize that it's good to slow down. It's good to be with family. It's good to spend time together. And I'm glad you got that reward as well.
You know what, Chris, what I find amazing is one, the resilience of the human spirit, but also just because we're in this together, the amount of people that come together and just wave and say hi, even if they're social distancing, they do that because we're looking at each other like this is, for us, unprecedented in our lifetimes. And it really now supersedes who you are and what you look like, because this is not discriminatory. It's essentially available and coming after everybody. So to be able to look at each other with a different lens, and I'm seeing that differently in my own little neighborhood. So it's been really amazing just to see the connectivity of folks that are just out and about.
Yeah, it's human, right? It's a human condition. We all experience it. We're all very fragile and frail, and we all realize that at the same time.
Exactly.
But does this virus, this pandemic, just this whole social issue bring up more conversations about equity now more than ever? I mean, while it's affected us all, it doesn't affect us all the same way, or does it?
No, it does not. And I mean, the numbers prove that. Like, you can even go to the state website or even the Pinellas County dashboard and see that or the dashboard in general for the counties for Tampa Bay and see how it's disproportionately impacting communities of color. What the group that comes up the most, frankly, is African Americans for a variety of reasons. But there, for example, in Pinellas County, African Americans account for 9.9% of the population and are 16% of the COVID cases, 14% of the hospitalizations, and 7% of the deaths. So it's disproportionate even here, even though it's not really talked about that heavily, but there's reasons for that. And some of those reasons are very simple. And ones we probably don't really consider is that, and generally speaking, African Americans are in a lower income pool. So they're less apt to be in single family housing, which is more exposure because you're around more people. You're more apt to take public transportation, more exposure around more people. You're more likely to be in lower wage jobs, which puts you on the front lines in many cases, again, more exposure to people. So when you start to look at some of these things, there's reasons why these are happening. Yes, there are underlying conditions that pre-exist COVID-19, but are also part of systemic challenges around equity when it comes to healthcare. And there's a lot of, and we won't go into all of that right now, but there's a lot of reasons for that. So for it to be easily dismissed as it's just their problem because they have higher, they have more of the underlying conditions, that's not the full story. There's a reason for those as well. So there's the full story that goes along with this. But yes, unfortunately, and the next group that's getting hit pretty hard is the Latinx population. So Black and brown communities are bearing the brunt of this.
Yep. And, just for Joe, just so you know, Eric's done some work for the Chamber Board itself. He used to be on our board, but he's helped our board and our staff through a process of really understanding our diversity and equity and inclusion goals and what we're trying to do. But so, and I know, Joe, you've been part of this too, as far as courageous conversations and what the Healthy Foundation for Healthy St. Pete have done. But Eric, do you think that, do you think that St. Pete can, has at least a half a step up on folks as far as even understanding that this didn't affect everybody the same way? Because I could be an ignorant white man right now and say it affected everybody the same way and move on with our lives, right? But in St. Pete, we are trying to pause and really say, wait a second, say that again, help me understand what you just said. Do you believe that the environment which you're operating in is helpful now because we've had the courageous conversations enough that you can use this as a real life lab example?
Yeah, I mean, and I know we're going to get into this later, but this is a great segue. The conference that we're doing coming up soon, Equity Amid Crisis, the amount of people that have supported this conference and that are at the table to have this discussion, for me, is unprecedented. I realized I had relationships, but I didn't realize it was to this magnitude and so many people were interested, you included, of having this conversation and then continuing it to move. What I find amazing is that I think as a community, we're well prepared to emerge from this crisis with an understanding that these disparities exist and can do something meaningful about them. The challenge with it that's going to come, as always, is the fear of, I don't know what to do. I don't want to make a mistake. I want to do the right thing, but I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing. So I just don't move at all. I kind of go back into business as usual. Unfortunately, based upon what's happened, business as usual doesn't exist anymore. There's going to be a new normal, or as a good friend of mine said, a new equilibrium. And that equilibrium is going to thrust equity in the forefront, whether you're looking at talent management systems. And what does that look like now? If you're looking at xenophobia and the fact that it's hit people with people from Asian descent, the Latinx population, people that are from the Middle East, and African Americans. So there is essentially a level of fear of those who don't look like me. And so those things are now at the forefront because now we have to look at where are the safe spaces when I re-engage, when I come back to the workplace. What does that look like? How are we going to work with essential workers? How are we going to get past the fear associated with a pandemic? So there's a number of pieces around equity that are going to have to be addressed if we're going to get to an equilibrium that's going to be beneficial for all.
Great. And the business community is an important part of this message, right? I mean, so you've got, I just reviewed the agenda and let's talk about it, but you've got a lot of different social services groups represented, those who are in the trenches every day, the community members. But, to me, why I wanted to have you on today, so we give people a week to get it on their schedule, is it's important that the business community engage in this conversation and learn, listen, because this is about how we have such an amazing amount of resources to help businesses get to that next stage quicker now. And what Joe and I have always been talking about to all these businesses the last 10 weeks is what are you going to learn from this to jump you over to, don't just stand in line, jump over people in this line because of what you've learned. And this is that opportunity. So what you're doing for us next Thursday and Friday is kind of helping us take advantage of that. So help me understand, like, what if people join your seminar or your webinar next week, what are the kind of conversations they can engage in?
So there's a variety of things that we're going to be talking about at Equity Amid Crisis. And I think what's amazing is the number of people that are going to be here and what they're actually going to be talking about. We're going to be talking a little bit about data. So we're going to talk about what do we know. So what do we know about the pandemic? What do we know in terms of how it's impacted, whether it's been from a health perspective, small businesses, as well as nonprofits, and what's happening on the ground in terms of being able to move through this? What are some of the lived experiences? We're also going to be chatting a little bit about where are the gaps. So where are the gaps? What's being experienced? Again, where are there areas that we can make some improvements? Where are some of the challenges that may not have been talked about in the media as much? And that's kind of gives you a good perspective. And of course, setting up what this is all about and why it's important is going to be day one. Day one is about what's the data, where are the gaps, what's the information where there's challenges. The next day, we do a little bit of self-care with some Zumba, a little bit of yoga and meditation for the first half of the day on Friday. And then we move into the second half of the sessions, which are talking about how do we leverage resources? How do we work smarter, not harder? And bringing, again, the business, education, government, as well as nonprofit sectors together to talk about how we can leverage our existing resources to move further faster as a community. We're also going to talk about how do we move the needle. So this is kind of more of your classic diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of conversation, which speaks to our mantra of the presence of diversity plus the practice of inclusion within an equitable environment is the context for innovation. So when you bring great people together from a variety of backgrounds with great ideas, and you give them a voice to be heard, that's when you get the greatest return on your workforce in terms of them being productive. So from that perspective, we're kind of wrap it up with a call to action. What are we going to do about this? Which kind of gives you, which kind of speaks to your point now of how can we move further forward? And really what that's going to encompass is some of the things that we've talked about within this conversation around equity from the beginning. Being willing to listen to you, not to be heard, not to respond, but to be heard. So I want to understand your perspective. I don't necessarily have to respond. I don't necessarily have to engage in the sense of trying to figure out, well, how do I engage in a conversation or how do I refute what you say? But more so, what's your perspective and why? So getting a chance to get to know your neighbor, putting neighbor back in your neighborhood, wanting to know people a little bit more and realizing now through this pandemic, as you said, we're really fragile as a group of people. Also, we're very resilient, but with that understanding of us being in this together, we can move further faster as a community. We start to take the isms away and really start to look at the person at the core.
Right on. And from day one, you and I have always talked about this is about a lot of things. It is about just doing the right thing. First of all, it is about being a good person and being doing the right thing no matter what. But for those, for what my mission is, we're trying to make St. Pete the best place on earth, and we're trying to make every business the most profitable, best business on earth. And you have got to be good at understanding this conversation if you want to be in those categories. You cannot be a community, a first choice community in this world if you can't speak about what equity means. You can't be the best business in the world and the most preferred employer in the world if you don't understand and how to have great conversations, empowering conversations that move us all forward unless you can do that. So even if you don't think you need this, you need it to become world class. And Eric's providing us a pretty neat opportunity.
Absolutely. It's something, to your point, what's amazing is that the numbers, these aren't Eric Smith's numbers, this is just straight census data. If you look at the generation that people like to talk about a lot are millennials. They're a pivotal generation. They were a game-changing generation. But 43% of that generation is African American, Asian, or Hispanic. If you look at the generation behind them, that's 51%. If you look at the generation of my sons, they call them Gen Alpha, they're closer to 55% African American, Asian, or Hispanic. So if you look at that generation as a whole, our country from that generation's perspective has already become majority minority. So it's to the point of you really can't ignore this conversation because it's coming and the trends aren't shifting any other direction. So part of this is really to kind of get on board because the train's already left the station, so to speak. So it's time to get on board and figure out from our perspective and not pass it off to our children and say, well, they can figure it out. No, it's kind of on us to help prepare them for what's happening next.
One of the things I like to always remind folks when we talk about equity is that we are largely the sum of our inputs, and we'll talk about conversations and we'll talk about programs and things that we need to work on, and those are all very important. But as someone listening to this right now, if this resonates with you, you can immediately take action and go and change your inputs, diversify your inputs. It's just that simple. Read the Weekly Challenger and go to get food in a different neighborhood that's different than you, and just sit in the cafe or sit in the restaurant and experience that. Look for a different kind of entertainment, because we get part of the bridge is just simply that. It's just a separation because of the patterns that we fall into, and this is a very easy action to take to take steps to move in the right direction.
Joe, it's funny you say that because you've heard this, and I'll probably ad nauseum of how do you expect to do the same things that you've already done and get a different outcome? I think they call that insanity in so many words. So idea is that you have to change something. So the two questions that I ask people just to consider, and those who are listening, is just really consider this. You don't have to answer this. Just answer it to yourself. The last time that you had your friends over, and I'm going to define friends as people that have crossed the threshold of your home and broken bread with you at your table. How many of them did not look like you? Second question is the last time you went to a friend's house. Same criteria applies. Same question. How many of them did not look like you? Depending on how you answer those questions speaks directly to your point. If you look at that and you realize, wow, everybody looked like me, then it might be some time. If you're really interested in this conversation, and if you're really interested in change or embracing the new equilibrium or new normal, you might want to consider how you can change that a little bit.
Man, that's beautiful. So tell people how they can join the webinar next week.
Absolutely. You can come to inclusivitylllc.com/events and check it out there. Or to make it really easy, just text 71441 and you can register there as well.
Beautiful. All right, man. Well, I will see you there. I'm glad you invited me, and I'm glad you were part of this today. And Eric, thank you for just helping me and the chamber be leaders in this community by just learning and you being willing to just nudge me. You've been a great partner of mine by just willing to teach me in a way that I need to be taught. So thank you. And I hope you can continue to do it for all the businesses here in this community and across the world, brother. So
looking forward to it. Thank you both.